If you happened to be watching this programme last week, you'd have heard me say that this book about English parish churches contains pictures of 193 churches, but only 10 of them are in the north. Is this fair? Is it enough? Here are just a few of them that got missed out. To be honest, I don't mind which church I'm in. I find them all fascinating. I pick one at random and there's always so much to look at in it. This one's got super architecture, tremendous arches, low and heavy, and it's got wonderful old roofs as well. It has some very interesting stained glass too, some medieval bits and pieces and the occasional vivid Victorian window. It's got some oddities too. The way the church clock pendulum hangs free like that is very unusual. You can tell, I'm sure, that churches have been a tremendous source of joy for me. For example, I once had the immense pleasure of seeing a vicar fall out of the pulpit. He was a fiery preacher, used to wave his arms around a lot, but he was also a tiny little man who had to stand on a box so that he was visible over the edge of the pulpit. And unfortunately, for him, not for me because I loved it, in mid-floor he stepped backwards off the box and fell right down the stairs, disappeared entirely. Mind, he was made of good stuff, that vicar, because he was preaching again before he was visible. I'll tell you another thing about churches. I often do naughty things in them when I'm on my own. I sneak into the vestry and look at the vases, and I see if there's any pictures of the church before it was restored. And if it's not locked, I have been known to have sneaky goes on the organ. But mostly I just look and explore the building, and this one's great. It's all very powerful, and the roof timbers are old and impressive too. So this is a typical medieval parish church, stuffed to the gunnels to satisfy the inquiring mind. But, and this is the point of this programme, so you should sit up and pay attention, is it a northern church, eh? Is this recognisably northern? Time to pop outside. How did he do that? So, what do you think of that? Do you think it looks northern? Or could it be in the south of England? Or Wales? If it is in the north, which county might it be in? Could you tell from the stone or from the shape? I ask these questions because one of my books, North Lancashire, a little bit of a clue there as to where we are, describes this church as a typical late medieval North Country church. What it means by late medieval is easy enough. It means that it was built in the late 1400s or maybe even the early 1500s. What it means by typically North Country is a bit more difficult to say. I think it means it's quite plain and low and hugs the ground, except for the tower, of course, which is mighty. But even the tower's not that high, and it's broad and spreading. It looks a reliable sort of church, doesn't it? Solid and dependable. Does that sound northern? Well, I think it does. And I think it is a typical northern church. If you wanted, I could list a couple of dozen others that it reminds me of and that would merit the same sort of description. This one's called St Michael's on Wyre, and it's not that far from Blackpool, and as it happens, it's one of my favourite church buildings. One of many, of course. The trouble with describing something as typical is that there isn't really such a thing. There isn't even a typical north of England. I mean, what's the centre of Newcastle got in common with the Yorkshire Dales or York with Manchester? Nought. Nothing at all. But what you can say about northern churches is that there are things up here which you'd be pushed to see anywhere else. Things that the north is good at, things that it's worth making a special journey up north in order to see. The ruined abbeys of North Yorkshire, for example. Thanks to Henry VIII and his domestic problems, England's stuffed with beautiful and romantic ruined abbeys. But nowhere can you see them in more glorious profusion than in North Yorkshire. The monks came to the north because it was wild and secluded. They were determined to escape from the world after all, but they also came because it was a beautiful and a spiritual place. One of them wrote that stones and trees will teach you a lesson that you never heard from masters in school. So that's one group of buildings that it's worth coming north specially to see. Another group includes the Anglo-Saxon churches of northern England. The north, and especially the north-east from the Scottish border down into North Yorkshire, is amazingly rich in churchy stuff from Anglo-Saxon times. And that's because the ancient kingdom of Northumbria, which stretched from the Firth of Forth down to the Humber, was A, Christian, and B, amazingly civilised. Great works of art were created up here. The Lindisfarne Gospels were illustrated at Holy Island around the year 700. Over on the west side of the country, north of Carlisle, the Bewcastle Cross is a remarkable piece of carving. In fact, one of my meanie about the North architecture books even goes further and says there is nothing so perfect and of a comparable date in the whole of Europe. I hear you gasp. Perfect? Whole of Europe? North of England? Must be good. And it is a wonderful thing in a wild place. There were great people up here too. The Venerable Bede, to name but one, spent the whole of his life at the monasteries of Jarrow and Sunderland, which were founded in the year 685 AD, and of which large and atmospheric chunks survive, the oldest post-Roman stone buildings in the country, containing a few fragments, incidentally, of Europe's oldest surviving window glass. This is where Bede lived, and his claim to fame is that he was a brilliant writer, a wonderful writer of history and biography, and almost certainly the greatest northeasterner of all time. And in saying that, I'm even including St. Alan, the sainted Alan Shearer. So he must have been good. This is the building that gives the clearest indication of what Anglo-Saxon churches looked like. It's at Escombe, just outside Bishop Auckland in County Durham, surrounded by council houses and a big circular churchyard, which probably started life as an ancient pagan holy site and got snaffled by the Christians when they came along. They snaffled the stone for their building too. Naughty snafflers, those Anglo-Saxon Christians. They pinched it from a Roman fort just a couple of miles down the valley, and this is what they built. A relatively unaltered Anglo-Saxon building that stood here for about 1400 years. It's one of only 3 complete Anglo-Saxon buildings in the whole country, and I find it really moving that it still exists here after so many centuries. A northern church. It's in the north, it's built of northern stone. Its proportions, tall and narrow, very tall and very narrow, are shared by all of the Anglo-Saxon churches in the north, but not by the Saxon churches elsewhere in the country. So this is northern in a deep sense. So is this, though it doesn't look especially unusual from outside. This is the church of St. Gregory the Great at Kirk Newton, which is deep, deep in the Border Hills. Scotland's no more than a stone's throw, a caber toss up the road, and the closeness to Scotland has produced a group of churches which in this country is unique to this particular area. What you need to know is that for 300 years there was a war going on between Scotland and England. Not 30 minutes or 3 years, but 300 years. It ebbed and flowed a bit, naturally enough. There were better times and worse times, but on and off for 300 years the extreme north of the country was dangerous, and dangerous times need special solutions. And as you'll see in other programmes in this series, the extreme north became, in a sense, the castle capital of Britain. Anybody who could afford it built themselves a home which could be defended. And even God, it seems, wasn't safe, and his house needed to be protected too. So here we are, in the church of St Gregory the Great, deep in the wilds of Northumberland, just a few yards from the Scottish border, where even God's house wasn't safe from attack. Parts of this church were rebuilt rather tamely in Victorian times, but not the chancel, not the east end. Look at the chancel arch first of all. Primitive, would you say? A bit medieval DIY-ish? That's about my standard of DIY, actually. Narrow and crudely arched. And then there's this carving, which is supposed to be the three wise men, but whew, how wild is that? The three hairy Scotsmen in kilts. And that leads us into the chancel itself, which is more like being in a dungeon than in a church. Stone vaulted roofs like these are common in the north. I've seen dozens, maybe hundreds of them, just as low and rough as this. But usually they're found in the basement of castles, not in churches. And yet this was supposed to be the holiest part of the church. But of course the point was to make this as much like a castle as possible. It's a pattern that's repeated all over the region. Churches with powerful stone roofs, arched and vaulted like castles. Others have got no windows, or virtually no windows. Or mighty towers built into them to act as a place of defence for the parishioners. The alternative in the remotest places was for something like this to happen. It's said that in medieval times this chapel was desecrated by blood. The priest was murdered at his altar and the church was abandoned forever. All over the country there were thousands of new churches built in the 19th century as the population rose and towns grew bigger. And Lancashire, because its towns were growing so fast, built more new churches than most other places. It also somehow built stranger and more innovative churches. This one springs to mind. This is in Toxteth, part of Liverpool, and as you can see superficially, at first glance, it looks a fairly ordinary Gothic-y sort of building, except that it's an unusual pink and reddish-brown in colour. The reddish-brown bits are straightforward, they're made of brick. Lots of brick churches, there's nothing very innovative in that. But the pink stuff, well, now that's cast iron, and that is odd. Everything pink is made of cast iron. This plinth is made of cast iron. I know it looks like painted stone, but it's not. These are cast iron plates. All of the windows are made of cast iron, and the pinnacles, the frilly bits along the top, all cast iron. Very bizarre, but very successful. It's even prettier inside, in my opinion, and it's even more iron. The piers are iron, the roof's iron, it's all iron. There are two churches like this one and another in nearby Everton, which is very similar, and they were both designed by the same architect, a reasonably well-known national figure called Thomas Rickman, who was responsible for the design. This was his style. There was a very similar church by him in Carlisle when I was little. Demolished now, but the same style as this, but not made of iron, of course. It's the use of iron that makes it seem extraordinary. The iron was the choice of the client, the man with the dosh. He was called John Cragg, and he was the owner of the Mersey Iron Foundry. For some reason that I can't quite explain, I think that John Cragg is a great name for an industrialist, especially an ironmaster. Mr. Cragg, the ironmaster. Anyway, he was passionate about iron and he wanted to sell it, of course, and so, as a kind of advert, he looked for ways to show it off everywhere he could. So in 1813, he got Thomas Rickman to build him this, and it's amazing, it's unique, nearly as odd as Holy Trinity in Fallowfield in Manchester, which might look fairly normal at first sight, as if it's built of brick and stone, but it isn't. It was the first building in the country to be built almost entirely in terracotta, and it was done for exactly the sort of reason that we've just been seeing in Toxteth. Terracotta's made of the same sort of clay as ordinary brick, but very, very fine, and you often find the clay in layers underneath coal seams. So here there was a local colliery owner called John Fletcher who had masses of clay in his coal mine, and he wanted a showcase for his product. So in 1845 he got an architect called Edmund Sharp to do it for him. Terracotta, inside and out, except for the rubble in the core of the walls. If you look really closely, you can see that they've even simulated the mason's chisel marks on the surface of the blocks to make it look even more like real stone. It wasn't very well received when it was built. It was rather disrespectfully described as a pot church, and I don't think many people have followed the style since, but it was innovative. And so was this. This is in Fallowfield too, just a stone's throw from the pot church. It's called the First Church of Christ Scientists, and I only want to spend a moment or two here because I want to come back later in the series and have a proper look at it. But I wanted to show you it now in case you thought that what I was saying was that all of the innovation in 19th century Lancashire churches was just freakiness. Actually, this isn't 19th century. It was built in 1903 by a Manchester architect called Edgar Wood. But it isn't freaky either. This is originality, possibly the most original church design of its date in the whole of Europe. Now there's a bold claim. And finally, as they say, time to lift mine eyes unto the hills, to one last distinct group of churches that you'd have to come north to see. They're found in the hills, and mainly, though not quite exclusively, in the Lake District, land of my mother and all of my aunties and uncles, a stomping ground of my youth. This is my favourite country, so you can imagine that you're not going to get much cool, critical analysis here. You're going to get biased enthusiasm. There are old churches in the Lake District, a few wonderful churches, but not many. Most of this area was very wild and very remote in the Middle Ages, and it wasn't until the 16th century that the population began to rise as sheep farming became more profitable and miners came to dig for the mineral wealth that was being discovered in the hills. Now, you know what sheep farmers and miners like to do best of all when they've got a bit of spare time? They like to go to church, of course. What on earth were you thinking of, you nasty, cynical beast? So wherever settlements sprang up, so did churches. I'm not talking about big churches, I'm talking about Dale's chapels. Tiny little chapels deep in the hills. Not very old, not at all fancy, like this one at Mungrisdale near Keswick, which dates from 1756. There aren't loads of Dale's chapels, 15 or 16 that I can think of, but they're all more or less like this. Simple little boxes, often whitewashed. No tower, unless one was added later. Not very churchy windows. This one's actually a little bit posher than some in having arched windows. Usually they're just ordinary house-style windows, and often they're very sweet inside. Simple oak furniture, simply carved, resting on plain stone floors and set against plain white walls. Stained glass isn't common. Who needs stained glass when you've got the Lake District hills outside? I bet the vicar sometimes wished that there was stained glass to stop his flock gazing out wistfully at the hills. Of course, it's impossible to generalise about what a northern church is supposed to look like. The north's far too varied and complicated for that. I think that words like solid and plain, simple and strong fit the bill quite often, but even when they don't, I hope that we've seen enough to show that the North's churches can be as good as the best, and certainly worth more than 10 measly photographs in anybody's book of architecture.